Self-Employed by Walter Winward. Sometimes it could be a very rewarding job. Like all jobs, of course, it had its awkward, irritating moments, but in the last analysis it was better to be one's own boss than work for someone else. He tried being an employee when he was younger, but it hadn't been a successful experiment. Whether he was employed by a shipping company or an insurance company or even a bank, there was always someone with a little power who'd make life hell. Mainly they'd make life hell for him, never anyone else. Chalmers, do this. Chalmers, do that. Chalmers, these figures are incorrect. Chalmers, when will you learn that it's only by constant endeavour, by studying and mastering your profession, that you will get on? The trouble was they were right. He'd always known that. But they were not right for Fred Chalmers. They were right for the others, for the slaves, for those who'd always be employees, but not for him. He was an individual. He couldn't work for others. He had to be his own master, make his own decisions. Sometimes he'd be right and sometimes he'd be wrong, but they were his decisions. And that was what life was all about, making decisions and standing by them. Weighing up the various factors involved and then taking action. Always that. Always taking action. Never clock watching or wishing to God it were Saturday or planning next summer's holiday. He sipped his coffee and glanced down at the newspaper by his elbow. It was 3 days old, but that didn't matter. 3 days old or 3 months old, the same tales of woe were always bannered across the front page. War, famine, rape, murder, robbery, accident, eviction. Why in God's name was it that newspapers concentrated on such things? Wasn't anything pleasant happening in the world? Yes, of course it was. Outside it was spring, and the daffodils in the park were yellow and fluffy. On the lake the drakes would be squabbling with each other over a mate. Children would be laughing and dancing and skipping, and their parents would be keeping an anxious eye on them, scolding them when they went too near the water. The trees were in bud, and soon the buds would become leaves and winter just a memory. Of course pleasant things were happening in the world. It was only unpleasant people who made the opposite seem the norm. A man learned a lot about people when he worked for himself. It was not like being a member of a vast corporation, where if something went wrong there was always someone else to carry the can. A man who was self-employed had to know about people, otherwise he rapidly went out of business. He learned to tell the difference between the bad and the good, the fortunate and the unfortunate, the avaricious and the meek, the go-getters and the hell-benters, and the placid, let's do something unusual and watch the televisioners. He learned by studying their eyes and their hands and how they stood, to tell whether they were going to try to put one over on him. It was a lonely life, naturally, when one was managing director, travelling salesman, chief clerk, and all the et-ceteras of one's own firm. His solitary assistants showed promise, but it would be years before he could say to the lad, "OK, it's all yours. I'm pensioning myself off." One assistant. All right, so it was a small organisation, but it was unique in its field. And who else of the slaves he'd left behind him 20 years ago could say that they had their own firm, small or not? Anyway, lonely life or no lonely life, it had been a damn good and interesting one. For almost half of his 53 years he'd been happy doing what he wanted to do, doing what he was certain, what he's been born to do. He'd made very few mistakes in those years. In fact, the single major mistake of his life had been made before he set up on his own. He was 29 and she was 24 when they met. Her name was Mary, and he'd fallen for her immediately. She was a beauty, dark hair and darker eyes, and so small and light he could have picked her up in one arm. The lads around the office where he then worked used to tease him, saying that shy Freddie Chalmers stood no chance at all with a girl like Mary. She had a reputation for being fast and flighty, and her tastes were in the expensive dinner and sports car league. He'd plucked up enough courage to ask her out on 2 occasions, and he'd been refused twice, but he persevered, and the 4th time he asked her out, she said yes. It had been a wonderful evening. They'd had a simple meal and a bottle of wine, and he'd listened while she chatted about everything she'd done and all the things she wanted to do. He hardly spoke at all. There was no need. He loved to listen, and she loved to talk. Later, when he took her home, she seemed very surprised that he made no attempt to kiss her good-night. He took her out again, and then a third time. The lads in the office were amazed. What the hell did Freddie Chalmers have that none of the others had? Perhaps they'd misjudged him. Perhaps old Freddie had something tucked down his trousers that none of them knew about. Perhaps he was giving Mary a slice of the cake she'd always been looking for but never found. He didn't understand it either. He liked to think it was because he was gentle with her. Because he gave her a good, relaxing time without demanding anything in return. He liked to think it was because of the flowers he sent her, or the fact that, in some way, she knew he secretly took dancing lessons in order to be able to please her the more. But really, he didn't understand it. The only thing he did understand was that he was fascinated by her. He proposed within a month, and she accepted. He walked on clouds. The lads in the office shook their heads and gave the marriage a year at most. Whatever it was that made Flighty Mary want to marry a dullard like Freddie, sooner or later she would again show her true colours. The she-leopard did not change her spots that easily. One day Freddie would be sorry he'd taken her on. A quick bang in the hay was one thing. Marriage was a different ladle of soup. He knew about the gossip and it didn't bother him. Where all the others had failed, he had succeeded. He had his Mary and she was happy. To be exact, she was happy for just under a year. Looking back, it was difficult for him to pinpoint the precise moment she started to complain they didn't get out enough. He was working during the day and studying in the evening. It was against his nature to study for advancement in this particular job, but he was doing it for her. He wanted to give her more and more and more. He wanted her to have a house of her own, and not just furnished rooms. He wanted to be able to buy a car and take her out for spins on a Sunday. He wanted her to have a new dress whenever she needed one, and so he studied. One night she announced that she was going out. "Where to?" he asked. "Oh, just to see some friends. You stick with your books, love. I won't be long." She was away an hour, and then it was 2 hours, and then it was 2 hours 3 times a week, and then it was every night. He heard talk around the neighbourhood and in the office that Mrs. Chalmers had been seen going into a dance with a man. He ignored it. There was more talk. Mrs. Chalmers had been seen here, there and everywhere, with one man, another man, a third man. Poor Mr. Chalmers, the talk said. He married a tart. The lads in the office nodded wisely. The day he decided to go home early had been a bad one for him. He had a splitting headache, and it seemed that everyone in the department had the name Mary Chalmers on their lips, or his name. Poor Freddie. Didn't know what he was letting himself in for. Had it on the best authority that she was getting the business in an alley off Praed Street. Well, I can name you a dozen blokes who've been there. She's quite a lay. Though, Mary, she throws it around a bit. Who's complaining? I haven't had my share yet. Just call her up, she's available. Listen, she does one of the greatest turns this side of the Thames. Poor Freddie. The headache grew worse. Poor Freddie, she's quite a lay. Throws it around a bit. Just call her up. Poor Freddie. Poor Freddie. Poor Freddie. It couldn't be, he told himself on his way home. It couldn't be. It was another Mary, not his Mary. She wouldn't do it. Every penny he earned was for her. He'd do anything for her. Die for her. Not his Mary. Not his. But it was his Mary they were all talking about. He knew it, so he didn't call when he got inside the front door. He walked straight into the bedroom, and there she was, naked, thighs wide, moaning, whispering dirty, unbelievable things to the man on top of her. The whore, the filthy, dirty, spew-ridden whore. He tore into the man and then into his wife. He beat her until his arm ached, until she was crying and sobbing and begging him to stop, but he kept on and on until she bled. The divorce was a simple matter. The judge didn't blame him for beating her, and she did not defend. It was impossible for her to defend. Now that it was all out in the open, a dozen witnesses came forward to testify that they had seen her with this man or that man, or another man. The list seemed endless. Everybody was sorry for poor Freddie, and everybody was getting a tight little vicarious thrill out of denouncing another man's wife as a whore and seeing him squirm. The judge, he thought, summed it all up very succinctly. My sympathies are with you, Mr. Chalmers. Although your wife is not in court, and I wish she were, as I'd like to say this directly to her, it seems likely to me that she will come to a very unpleasant end unless she mends her ways. She will not always be a young woman. If she is by nature licentious, then she will one day find that her looks have gone, and that she has no weapons left with which to gratify her desires. She had left the district after that, and changed her name, and he had not seen her again. The newspaper fell off the table and startled him. He picked it up. But he'd been lucky, he thought. If she'd been the ideal wife, he might have studied forever and finished up as a minor employee. As it was, her departure had left him nothing to live for except himself. And so he had set up on his own. Yes, one way or another, things had turned out for the best. There was a knock at the door and his assistant came in. It's time, sir. He nodded and got up from the table. He followed his assistant along the whitewashed passage and into the execution chamber. He mounted the scaffold and checked that everything was in order. Not that he had any need to check. His assistant was a bright lad and would have made sure that the trap was functional and the noose just right. It was a moment before they came through the doorway, the governor, the chaplain, the warders, and the condemned woman. He kept his back to them and only turned when she was on the trap. He let her see him. He wanted her to take a good look. Mary, he whispered softly as he put the hood over her head. He said your looks would go, and they have. Did he want to leave you, Mary? Is that why you killed him? Her knees buckled, but the warders kept her upright. He was very careful about the position of the knot. It had to be just under the ear. He was a perfectionist. He heard her moan and mumble a prayer, and he knew from past experience that now her insides would be loosening, and she would be smelling the fetid smell of her own filth. He moved towards the lever that would send her to eternity, and waited for the signal. Yes, sometimes it could be a very rewarding job.